Hi everyone, and welcome to today's lesson. This is the second part of a two-part lesson on rhythmic drawing from life. So I'm going to be carrying on the drawing that I did last week of this deer skull. Everything's kind of reasonably established, so if you watched the previous lesson you'll remember we spent time kind of finding the kind of main central lines that form the foundation of the composition of the drawing, and then kind of worked out from there. So today we're still going to be trying to kind of produce lines that are fairly that have a rhythm of their own, and we'll be spending time looking at the sort of undulations in each different line in the image, as well as adding some value and form to it to kind of make it a bit more finished overall, and some detail. So at this point, we're going to go back to these lines that we established last week and try to find some more specific rhythms within each individual line. So if I take this outside contour at the back of the head, perhaps from the top of the antler down, I'm going to look for sort of specific little directional changes and at exactly what point they occur. So you'll find particularly natural objects, will have these sort of quite complex rhythms, and the more that you can sort of observe them and capture them, the more you'll capture that kind of specific, kind of unique specificness of life and rhythms that occur in nature. So I'm going to do that now. Initially I'm not going to actually erase any previous lines. I'm going to do that once I've started to kind of work around them and see exactly what I need to lose and what I can gain. So starting from the bottom, I'm just finding this sort of specific little point that just juts out slightly. You see it on the foreground part of the snout as well. So I'm carrying on using quite straight lines. When necessary I'm going to go back and erase if there's sort of a significant cut back. So as you're working around these edges, you could also start to go in and reinforce any of the shadows that are definitely going to end up quite a bit darker later on in the drawing. And obviously erase anything else that So you can see I've taken the opportunity to find some of these differentiations in the darks. As it's quite a substantial kind of part of that portion of the drawing. So I'm gonna, now that I'm roughly finished with that, blocking in this portion of the drawing, I'm going to return to the outside contour and carry on up towards the antler. There's some also some quite nice overlapping rhythms going on, so you'll have different portions of the drawing separate, I guess, lines that come down, say, over the top of the front of the skull compared with the back eye socket. So they're kind of two sets of almost competing lines that interact with one another. And that kind of adds to the complexity of the composition, the linear nature of the composition. anywhere that you can still find these sort of straighter lines. Up the edge of this antler, for instance, it's worthwhile reinforcing them just because they give a certain solidity to your drawing. You can anchor quite a lot of other more complex curved shapes that might surround them. So I'm now going to carry on working down this far edge, kind of work inwards to add some tone. The way that it's lit, because it's quite overcast light, the separation between the shadows and halftones is very, very subtle. So I'm actually just going in and patching in tone as it seems needed, and then I'll just erase if necessary, which is a slightly less structured way than we usually work. It can be a bit quicker if you're trying to produce quite a quick sketch from life. Or if, as in this case, you're quite limited by your setup or the nature of where you're working. Try to keep your shading fairly light. Where possible, also try to follow the form of what you're shading in. That way your strokes will kind of reinforce. They'll reinforce the form. And also kind of carry on that sense of rhythm throughout the drawing, which is what we're obviously after in this particular exercise. Something that's slightly tricky in this particular drawing is there are these sections of sort of darker bone compared to lighter bone which aren't actually really anything to do with the form. So in a more complex drawing I'd probably seek to capture that, but given the kind of limited time that I'm allowing for this one, I'm probably not going to try to capture that too much. Instead I'm just going to kind of have a look at the form and where necessary just sort of approximate what I think would be happening if the skull was made of exactly the same colour material all the way around. However, it is something that you could capture if you were working on something yourself and you wanted to get a bit more specific detail while working from a subject. So now that more of my halftones are established, I'm going to go back and reinforce some of these shadows. So I'm starting to work on some of these internal values and shadows. Most of the outside contour is finished. I'm going to return back to this right hand section near the end. But for now I just want to try to get all the major forms inside the skull finalized. So I'm basically just following the same approach that I took erasing my, sharpening my pencil. It's always important to try to keep your pencil as sharp as possible while working, especially as you get into kind of more detailed portions of the drawing like I am right now. So at this stage you can kind of start to have a bit of fun. Everything's fairly established. So anywhere you find like a little aspect of detail or any kind of subtle tonal shifts that work quite well, you can add them. You can also start to add little accents of dark to some of your line work, just to make it a bit more sophisticated. So I'm going to move back up to the outside edge of the drawing now. I'm just going to finish off this top right hand portion with the antler. So I'm going to do the same thing I did over on the left hand. You can see just flicking over really softly with a quite flattened kneadable eraser allows me to subtly remove tone. So it's good for, say, lightening shadows or large sections of halftones. So the final thing I'm going to do is just work on this back section. I'm probably not going to render it out entirely. But I am going to have a look at these quite interesting little shapes that occur behind the eye socket. So we're probably going to leave it off quite soon. Hopefully you've been able to follow my progress as I've drawn. From this point you can kind of develop it as much as you like. I would probably go about kind of starting to perfect my larger value relationships a bit. So one thing I've noticed looking at it just now is if you sort of blur your eyes, there's quite a big difference between the general value of the halftones in this lower portion of the skull compared with those halftones kind of moving towards the source of the light. So you might want to try to kind of mess around a bit with those larger relationships. That'll reinforce the sense of fall of light over the object that you're working on, whatever that may be. And obviously you could carry on adding a great deal more detail, especially if you have something as complex as this skull to work on. But this sort of level of finish is all I'm after. So if you can produce something like this and send it through to me, that would be great. Obviously that's only for members of the OCAD Studio, so if you want to check out OCAD Studio, follow the link in the profile for this video. If you have any questions about the video generally, just post below and I'll answer them. Yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing what you're able to produce. Thanks a lot.